Muy buenos días. Estamos acá en Encuentros del Futuro, parte del Congreso del Futuro 2018. Y estamos con dos tremendos invitados para hablar de temas muy interesantes como la democracia y la equidad y cómo las tecnologías permiten cambiar los modelos que hemos tenido en términos de tanto democracia como de equidad en el pasado. Y tengo acá dos grandes invitados. Ella es Hélène Landmore, PhD en Ciencias Políticas de la Universidad de Harvard, magíster de Filosofía en Ciencias Políticas y investiga la teoría democrática, los procesos constitucionales participativos y la democracia en el lugar del trabajo. Ella es la autora de Razón Democrática, Política e Inteligencia Colectiva y es propulsora de la idea de la democracia post-representativa o la democracia abierta. Acá tenemos a Guy Standing, que es un investigador y escritor británico, miembro de la Academia de Ciencias Sociales del Reino Unido y cofundador de la red global de una idea que se está volviendo cada vez más popular, que es la idea de la renta básica. Sus publicaciones están en economía laboral, derechos laborales, las políticas del mercado laboral y el desempleo. Y sus últimos trabajos han tratado sobre cómo se está precarizando el trabajo y cómo la economía y los estados debieran trabajar para enfrentar estos desafíos. Thank you very much for being here and for sharing your time and your ideas. So I've just introduced you and talked a little bit about how you guys are talking about the disruptions that we are living nowadays, both in terms of the democracy and the structures of the economy and equality. And I would like to first start talking a little bit, ask you a question, Len, and feel free to pitch in about the crisis and the challenges that we are living today in terms of the traditional models of representative democracy.
So there are many challenges. One of them is the fact that we live in a globalized age and that the representative democracy model was designed for the age of nation states. So that's definitely one of the challenges, that the sovereignty of nation states is challenged by all these economic trends. So we probably need to think beyond the classical borders of nation states and rethink our definition of the demos as well, make it more inclusive possibly. Another dimension is the fact that because of globalization and technical change, we have all these economic pressures on states that make them incapable of regulating large corporations the way they probably should. So one way to address that is probably to think of democracy beyond the purely political, right? And meaning thinking of applying it to the economic sphere. So I think we'll have at some point to really rethink firm governance and make it more accountable and responsive to all stakeholders, not just the capital investors who are basically in control at the moment.
Yeah.
So these are some of the challenges. And I think a final challenge is probably the rise of democratic expectations in citizens. Citizens, in the 18th century, it's one thing to get a representative government that you don't have much control over after all, because it's so much better than what came before, than a monarchy. But today, people are used in the marketplace in particular to having extreme control over products in a way. You can rate a movie, you can rate a product on Amazon, you can give immediate feedback. And with government, it's this really distant sort of set of institutions and mechanisms where we don't really get what we want, and we can't even really complain in sophisticated and clear terms. All we have is a vote, so we use it as a protest vote. That's Brexit, that's the Trump vote in my book. And so these are some of the challenges that I see with democracy right now.
Great. I want to talk more about that and post-representative democracy and open democracy models. But I actually want to just grab one of the things that you said, which is, the economic pressures have really changed the landscape of what we, I guess, envisioned when we created these democratic systems and these democratic structures. And that kind of leads me to ask you a question. You state that the current systems of work, right, and the current systems of the structure of societies have created this new social class called the Precariat. Could you just expand a little bit, because it's a very fascinating idea.
Yeah, I think I'd like to relate my comments to what Helen just said, which is that I think we've got a new global class structure that's taken shape. We've obviously got a plutocracy at the top, these multi-billionaires who have enormous power, and an elite that's working with them, serving them, who are making millions and millions themselves. The old working class, the proletariat, has virtually disappeared, be it in Chile, be it in the United States, or in Europe. And this precariat underneath is interesting for this discussion because it's millions and millions of people who have been plunged into a life of unstable labor, without any sense of occupational narrative, without any sense that they are advancing. And they're relying on declining real wages, stagnant real wages, and chronic uncertainty in their lives. And really, politically, the important thing is that there are three factions in the precariat. The first faction are what I call the atavists. These are people who've fallen out of old working class communities and families. They don't have a lot of education, this group, but they're looking backwards to a real or an imagined past. And this group, of course, is meat and drink for the Trumps, for the Brexit vote, for Marine Le Pen, and so on. And they're falling prone to the sirens of a neo-fascist dystopia that's opening up. The second group in the precariat, what I call the nostalgics. These are the people, many migrants, ethnic minorities, huge numbers now, who don't have a sense of home anywhere. This group, in terms of politics, is tending to detach itself. I don't belong anywhere, so why participate? The third group in the precariat, they're mostly young, but not only the young, who went to university, were promised a future, were promised social mobility, a career. They come out, they've got debt, they don't see a future. Now, this group won't go voting for neo-fascists, but they won't vote for the old social democrats or the mainstream left or right of center either. They're looking for a new politics of paradise, as I've called it in my books. And it's this group that I think is where we should have some optimism in the long term, because they're beginning to mobilize. But to go back to Helen's points, I think we are in a real crisis politically because we have a deep, deep corruption of what we mean by democracy. When you can get a Donald Trump elected when he tells 4 lies every day at a minimum, where he can be sold, when they can sell Brexit with systemic lies, you have to say, well, there's manipulation going on. The media are owned increasingly by the super wealthy. Our education systems are being corrupted by the Koch brothers buying up faculties and so on. And the manipulation goes on through Cambridge Mathematica, manipulating people's emotions and voting intentions and so on. So we've got a real crisis because we're in a plutonomy. The plutocracy have inordinate power. And then you have the revolving doors, where leading people go from being a politician one day, but they are feathering their beds for what they're doing after they step out of politics, and they suddenly emerge as executives of one of these big corporations, and then vice versa. And it's particularly important, as I've chronicled it in one of my books recently called The Corruption of Capitalism, with Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs has people everywhere. Now, I don't believe in conspiracies, but it's a remarkable fact. The governor of the Bank of England, Goldman Sachs, the head of the chair of economic advisors, Goldman Sachs, the leading politicians in Spain were Goldman Sachs. It goes on and on and on. It's financial capital coupled with the plutocracy creates a real existential problem for those of us who believe in democracy.
Well, yes. We were actually kind of like reaching, I'm going to do like a very, very brief pause, and I'm going to move to some of the solutions that you guys have posed, because I think some of the, what is fascinating about your ideas is that you don't only do like a diagnosis of this world that has changed very rapidly in the last few years, but also kind of like post some at least starting ways to change things for the better. Thank you very much. Continuamos en unos minutos. Muchas gracias. Hola, estamos acá de vuelta con Encuentros del Futuro, con Hélène Landmore y Guy Standing. Estamos hablando de algunos de los elementos que están generando crisis en nuestra democracia y en las estructuras económicas que tradicionalmente hemos tenido en los gobiernos en Occidente. Just before we went to the break, Guy was kind of like describing some of the pressures and some of the big changes that plutocracy and also you kind of mentioned how technology is also creating some mechanisms of pressure that I guess challenge some of the assumptions that we had with traditional representative democracy. And I would like to move a little bit to Helen, and maybe you could talk a little bit about some of your concepts and ideas regarding open or post-representative systems of democracy. Why are you proposing those ideas? And we can also chat about what might be some of the challenges in those systems as well.
Right. So why am I proposing those ideas? I guess it comes from both, a certain amount of time spent thinking about democracy and being exposed to democratic experiments like the Icelandic one, that really opened my eyes about the possibilities, really. I thought I had somewhat radical ideas before. Turns out you can go even further. And so it's a combination of all these things. So I had come to the conclusion that, for example, the current systems do not tap the collective wisdom of the larger group, right? It's really selecting individuals for certain qualities and hoping that adding these qualities in an assembly will make for a great, problem-solving machine. And it turns out that if we believe the social scientific knowledge we have now, it's not true. You need something else. You need group diversity. You need descriptive representativeness of the larger society in order to really get a sense of what the problems are everywhere, not just in a tiny sort of space of the polity. And so I thought that these mini-publics that are based on a random selection are a way to get that diversity back in the assembly that make decisions for us. So it's a new way of approaching democratic representation. And then the Icelandic experiment taught me that there's not just this dimension of changing how we think about democratic representation, there's also the question of finding ways to involve citizens more directly, if you will, like letting them access the center of power, where the agenda setting takes place, right? So, and I don't have, as I said during the talk, I don't have a sort of detailed blueprint of what a better democracy would look like. I think it's going to be about experimenting locally at different levels, also in online communities, which can experiment at low cost, what governance schemes would work better. But I think we have now all sorts of modules that are interesting and that we could combine differently, like hybrid assemblies. There's so many possibilities, and most of our conversations are about very narrow questions. Money in politics, gerrymandering, corruption. Even if we fixed all these things, I don't think we'd have a great system. So we need to think way beyond those local issues.
Yes, Kai, could you please? I have the idea that you want to maybe, yeah.
I think we have to revive the sense of deliberative democracy. And we could go back to ancient Greece to identify what was actually quite a good model. And the model was that essentially every citizen, okay, it was sexist and it was bad society in many respects, but every citizen was encouraged to be a participant in the agora, in the public space, in helping to shape the decisions. And actually they introduced a sort of basic income for rewarding people for using their time in that way. And if you take that forward to where we are today, we have a terrifying situation where I as someone on the left, tend to listen to the voices and the media that accord with my views. You might be, or someone else might be on the right, and they listen to what they hear. So we have reinforcing our prejudices or our particular views. We need to overcome that, and I think encouraging deliberative democracy. I live in Switzerland, where we have regular referenda on all sorts of issues. It's not ideal. There are certain problems, but to reinvent deliberative democracy, I would say, look, everybody should have a basic income, but when they start, if you're an adult, when you start receiving a basic income, you sign a statement agreeing to participate in elections and go to at least one meeting, a local meeting in your village or town each year and listen to the diversity of opinions. We need to strengthen our resolve against the manipulative algorithms and the corruption of the media.
And reopen dialogue, because that's, I guess, one of the big crises that we have right now. Yeah. The fact that we're kind of like all in these echo chambers that are not, that just like closes out.
Yeah, and it's a very scary phenomenon, as we were talking about earlier. I mean, I come from a country which is being afflicted by Brexit, which is going to have huge negative consequences because the liars got away with it. They did better media PR. So we are really in a dangerous situation.
How do we counter, I mean, this is certainly not an easy problem, but how do we counter the enormous power and influence that, you know, these giant corporations have? Because their stakes are huge. And
well, I mean, the trouble is it's a long economic analysis, but basically the neoliberals that took over in the 1980s have done their work. We no longer live in a neoliberal era. What's happened is we have rentier capitalism. The institutions at the international level and so on is channeling more and more of the income to property owners, intellectual property, financial property, physical property. And the rentier class, the plutocrats, are able to manipulate the politics. How do we confront that? Well, we must have revolt. I don't mean revolution. I'm not calling for revolution or anything. We must have building up of public pressure. There's a wonderful story of Franklin Roosevelt. He was visited by a delegation in the White House about a particular policy. He listened for 45 minutes. He asked questions. And at the end, he led forward and he said, okay, you've convinced me. Now go out in the streets and force me to do it. And I think we are almost at that stage. We need to mobilize, to put pressure on our politicians and our establishment.
I mean, I guess the Icelandic case that you mentioned is kind of like a good and clear example that, you know, I mean, it was, of course, under very, very heavy duress, but it did show a roadmap, right?
Yeah, there are crisis moments that you must seize in a way. Although the Icelandic case is you know, it's a sad story to a degree because the constitution that they rewrote wasn't passed as law. Because and that's the question that I wanted to turn to Guy. How do we get from here the diagnosis of the problems and the idea of, you know, change to there, the better ideal and the better regime? It's very hard. So in Iceland it failed because the people who had caused the crisis came back to power when things got better, and they just basically blocked the change. Yeah. And I am afraid that's what we're going to run to at every level. It's impossible for them to relinquish willingly. So I also not for revolution, but like how do you evolve or how do you change?
A little note on that. I've just come from Iceland myself, and they've just changed government again. So there's a little bit of hope.
Yeah, no, it's not over yet. I agree. They're still, this constitution has actually gained momentum abroad. There's a hardcore group of people who really are adamant that this needs to be passed at some point. So who knows? But I'm just saying it's going to take a lot of effort.
I agree.
A lot of fighting.
I think if I can answer Helen's basic point, I'm actually encouraged by the energy of the third part of the Precariat out there. I get invited to address groups all over the world. It's incredible, and emails all the time. And they're looking for a new progressive politics. You take Podemos in Spain, okay? It's a classic case. It's not articulating a very consistent line, it's divided, but this is inevitable. when a new politics takes time to emerge, but it's a new progressive way of thinking, and there's tremendous energy, and they've come a long way in a very short time. Go to somewhere like Denmark, you've got a new political party, Alternativet, which is sort of green left, Precariat party, which has suddenly got to the point 20% in the opinion polls, which would give it a chance of forming part of the next government. And you see it in other countries. In Britain, I'm an economic advisor to John McDonnell, and I remember when we started, everybody wrote them off as in Dead Men Walking. But in fact, they're beginning to articulate a new progressive politics. But it will take time. But I think we must encourage people to participate.
Yes,
I agree.
please.
And I completely agree with Guy about the necessity to revive deliberation and deliberative democracy. I think it's actually part of the solution, right? Because it could be that, if you don't follow the conspiracy theory, line and the idea that these plutocrats are in power, deliberately and all that, you could also think it's a result of a fundamental philosophical mistake. We invested too much, we put too much faith in the market and not enough in the forum, in the agora, in the deliberative exchange of ideas.
It's become an ideology.
So representative democracy right now, it's Schumpeterian democracy. It's like, party competing for votes, and whoever has the best idea is supposed to win, and the common good is supposed to emerge as a byproduct of that fight and competition. But the result is that you get a very limited amount of discussion and a very limited exploration of the possible solutions. And I think we should put a little bit less faith in this sort of invisible hand and more in actual exchange of arguments among individuals. Because we have to convince each other, including leaders, including elites, that this is not good for anyone, in fact, except on a very basic monetary level.
Don't we need new structures for that, though? That's where kind of like my own...
I think new organizations are beginning to emerge, new political movements, new forms of political movement, new forms of unions. I think that in a sense, there's been a clearing of the decks, like a boat, the decks. Old-style social democracy are dead men walking. That laborist agenda, which was progressive in the middle decades of the 20th century, is no longer progressive. And it's the fact that it's continued to exist has been an impediment for a new progressive politics, a green, ecologically driven politics, which is fundamental to the new politics, a redistributive agenda, not being frightened of saying we need to reduce inequalities. We need to reduce the insecurities of the precariat. And our politicians have got to be transformed. Right. But at the moment, they're very sluggish. They don't have strong backbones.
And so just to be on the optimistic side for a minute, I think that I can give you the counterexample, the counterpoint to Iceland, which is Ireland. In a few months after Iceland went through its process, Ireland managed to amend its constitution to pass marriage equality article, right? And they did that by with a constitutional convention that included 60% of randomly selected citizens and 34% of elected politicians. And it worked, the whole system worked and changed the law, which was very anti-gays, and by making the ordinary citizens and the politicians meet and agree. Whereas in the Icelandic model, they tried to be the outsiders. They excluded the politicians from the whole thing, and it failed. So my conclusion is that we're going to have to win over minds among the current members of the elite and the system, because the alternative to that is violent revolution, and the history is not so good there.
So yes, you have to plant seeds of virus within the existing systems in order to get change. That's a fascinating idea. So we have only about a minute left. I don't know if maybe you guys have some closing thoughts on that.
I particularly believe that the fundamental challenge politically is we have to construct a new income distribution system. And that's why I think a basic income has to be a part of that agenda. We can't go back and rely just on wages versus capital. We have to think out of the box for a new income distribution system, and that will define progressive politics going forward.
Thank you. What about you, Helen?
Well, I think one part of the solution will also be to fight this cult of the expert that we are in, this celebration of regimes like Singapore or China that are based on meritocracy and supposedly better than democracies. I think we have to empower citizens in part by giving them confidence in themselves, you know, and in their own judgment and their own capacity for self-rule.
Thank you very much. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for coming. Muchas gracias y nos vemos en otro episodio de Encuentros con el Futuro. Hasta pronto.